So, you have finally decided to fire your pastor. Now the question is, what's going to happen now? How are lives going to be changed? And what will the future of your church look like? What will your pastor's future look like? All very important questions when we consider this topic. Firing a pastor could be a very serious matter. You see, when you fire your pastor, it can be very difficult for him to find another job, because as it is, being a religious leader doesn't necessarily provide very good employment opportunities. It's hard, for example, to change professions, to go from being a religious leader of a group of over 100 people or so to working in the food industry or working in some other industry. And often what we find is that people have to make some improvise. Now, it was the Lord Jesus Christ himself that once said that foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. That's right. In fact, what the Lord Jesus Christ was telling us is that, for a matter of speaking, he was sort of homeless. And this was the case for his 3-year ministry. Now, if we assume that after your pastor's termination, he chooses to continue on in a Christ-like profession, and if, for example, he doesn't find himself called to another church, then we may find the same pattern of behavior. This pattern of behavior of going out into the wilderness, living among very uncertain circumstances, one would conclude. And what we see specifically is that it can be a hard and challenging time. It can be a hard and challenging time that really builds character and faith. One of the things that we see specifically is that when the Lord Jesus Christ went into the wilderness and was tempted by Satan for 40 days, 40 nights, that it was a very challenging time for him. It wasn't any sort of easy thing. And this is the kind of road that can lay ahead. There was a very great and very spiritual man that I once knew. He was a Baptist pastor. And he made it very clear how a person could survive in professional ministry on very limited resources. For example, he explained how squirrels could be trapped and eaten. You see, if I had a squirrel today to demonstrate, I would. What you could do is you could simply take a stick, wait until the squirrel approaches, hit it on the head, and then have tonight's dinner. He explained that the hind legs are the most meaty part of the squirrel. Now, some people like to eat the head, although I do not recommend that. But eating the hind legs provides the most nutrition, the most opportunity for meat. Now, if, for example, a squirrel has been rummaging through the trash, like let's say in the city, then eating the squirrel can be not a good thing to do. It may not taste the same way as a field squirrel. And this is one of the points that the Southern Baptist pastor made clear to instill into all those that he discipled. Now, not only is it the case that you can eat squirrels, but in an emergency situation, it is possible to cut a tree open, like in the case of a deciduous tree. Actually, I believe in the case of a tree that has pine needles, I should say. A carnivorous tree. And it is possible to cook and eat the actual interior of the tree itself. Now, it may not sustain your health for a great many days, but it is altogether doable. And there are quite a few other tricks to the trade too that can be learned and that could really greatly benefit you and your time of solitude. Now let's talk about housing. You see, it could be very difficult once no longer having a religious vocation, or possibly in the intermediate phase between churches, to get housing. Now let's just think about some housing options that are available for you. You see, there is, for example, the fact that you can search and possibly even find some old abandoned vehicles. Now, school buses make a very great sort of shelter, because oftentimes what happens is that big busing companies, what they will do is when they get done with using the bus for the kids, then they don't have anything that they can really use a bus for. And so they try to get rid of these buses. Well, a lot of times maybe they go to scrap, or some farmer gets them, and then the farmer doesn't really know what to do with them either. But a bus, among all vehicles, can be really the best, because it could be easily converted into an RV. It could cost maybe just a couple $1,000s. And what's good about a bus is that it's like a home away from home. During a time where it would otherwise be very depressing, a bus has a way of really letting the light in, you know. It's a sort of vehicle you can go into, sleep, and just let the light shine in on you. It's kind of vehicle that when you're driving down the road, you realize that maybe this kind of lifestyle feels better than the one you lived before. And not only is it the case that buses could be used, but even tents. Now there are some places, for example, like in Shawnee National Forest, where you can stay about 14 days in any one location before a forest ranger will tell you to move to another location. And as far as I know, that's still absolutely free. And so a person could live year-round in the wilderness and do very much like John the Baptist or any of the other Baptists had done before. Be very connected with God and nature. Have a prolonged spiritual experience. Something that, if it lasted for 3 years, then it would be possibly very comparable to the ministry of Christ, especially if you went into the towns and healed the sick and, you know, rose the dead, that kind of thing. Well, after the tendencies of Judas have finally gotten the better of you, and you've decided to fire the pastor, now the question is, what is life going to be like? What is it going to be like to go to church and now see the pastor's face smiling back at you, and knowing that you've provided for him and his family all this time, and that you're glad for another Sunday? What's it like to miss that? Well, you see, what the case is that once you fired your pastor, normally what happens is you get a whole situation where people in the church maybe don't like the decision, maybe people in the church do like the decision, and you get some commotion. Let's just assume for a moment that after you fired your pastor, the new guy that you hire maybe doesn't have a lot of experience. Maybe he doesn't care about your family. Well, in that case, are you going to feel comfortable having him in your home? Are you going to feel as comfortable with him at the pulpit, telling you what God has to say in your life, telling you how to live, telling you what to do, telling you the message from God himself? Are you going to feel comfortable listening to this man? From my understanding, it can take as many as 5 years for a pastor of a church to even begin to be in a situation where people find him to be their pastor. It can take 5 years for people to come to the conclusion that they trust the guy. 5 years before real serious development occurs, where it becomes more of a community. And when that guy is hired, don't you think it would be plausible that he might be afraid of his job too? Because if the last guy got fired, what about him? He could get fired the same way. You know, maybe there's a different situation where he can get fired, but you know what? He knows what's lurking ahead. And when that's the case, a person wants to be extra careful, cautious, and comfortable to ensure that nothing out of the ordinary, no extra efforts are made to put a person's employment at risk. Now that's very sad, because if that's the case, then there's no real certainty. There's no real certainty that if you do the right thing, that you won't have an uprising. You know, the right thing that's politically inappropriate or politically challengeable. You've fired the pastor. You've taken that great man of God that you always knew was a great spiritual leader in your community. Somebody that was such a great spiritual leader that you paid him quite a bit of money. And you've taken him to the cross and nailed him to it. Now the question is, what do you do with all that guilt, knowing what you've done? Do you just continue on? Do you try to cover up the theological issues that were really at the heart of why you fired the pastor? Do you just go on and not worry about it? Those are the real questions that you have to ask. Is it the case that you're going to be able to sleep at night after you've done what you've done? Are you going to feel as if demons are just creeping up on you, trying to get into your bed, and just breathing down your neck every second of the day? Because you know, deep in your heart, that you did the very things that Judas would have done. What happens come Judgment Day when there's God, and you see your old pastor, the one in whom you fired, and you hear him say to you, "Get behind me, Satan, you worker of iniquity," and perish in eternal darkness. Now, do you feel, given the fact that that could happen, that firing the pastor is the sort of justifiable end to a situation at hand? Now, I for one would like to make clear that I do not believe there's ever a situation where a congregation would ever have to fire their pastor, or should. You see, if a pastor, since he represents God, is really screwing up, then it's God who needs to fire him. Now, when God goes to fire the pastor, it could happen in a great variety of methods. God could, for example, destroy him. He could cause a series of incidents to happen in his life, such as fires, collisions, you name it, that would just literally obliterate him, or maybe him and his family. And so for the most part, there need not be any cause for concern if a pastor is screwing up. In fact, if a pastor is screwing up enough, your best course of action clearly is to just simply pray, "Lord, defend my cause." And quite frankly, the Lord will. He can do anything. He's created all of heaven and earth. Now, in the case where the Lord is just way too slow to defend your cause, and you absolutely have to fire your pastor, there are obviously going to need to be a few things you have to do to ensure that the congregation has clearly moved on from having the old pastor to having the new pastor. Some faith groups, for example, like to erect a tombstone, or like what we would consider maybe a monument. Now, it'd be more like a tombstone if you assume that he's going to hell. It might be more of a monument to assume that he did a good job and that he's going on to better things. Now, what would be helpful is if the situation is very severe and needs additional descriptive power to ensure that people take hold of the new pastor. It may be important to buy a casket and to set up the casket right at the church with the pastor's name on it, so that people assume every time they see that casket that he's gone and he's not coming back anytime soon. And this kind of activity, it might be best to be reserved for those situations where you really do need to fire your pastor